And our response to these latest tariffs is to fight, is to protect, and to build. We will fight.
Canada won't bow down to a bully. And we won't stand by as tariffs hurt our workers and their families. Trump wants us to lose our cool and to cave in.
In a stifling, politically charged press conference delivered after a high-stakes, closed-door meeting with Canada's most powerful political leaders, Prime Minister Mark Carney's every word was freighted with a sense of immense gravity. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The air in the room was thick.
America is not Canada. And Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, President Trump is once again vowing new tariffs, this time saying he'll double tariffs on imported steel from 25 to 50%. The president says they'll kick in.
And the glare of the television lights illuminated the grim faces of his cabinet members. With a critical August 1st deadline looming large, Canada is facing an existential economic threat, forced to confront the potential reality of new, punishing tariffs imposed by President Trump. Carney's measured but somber tone actively downplayed the chances of a last-minute breakthrough, while his deliberate choice of words suggested that the nation might have no viable alternative but to walk away from the table without a deal. This was not a simple statement of fact, but a carefully calculated strategic move designed to prepare the Canadian public for difficult news, while simultaneously signaling to Washington that Canada was not a country to be easily bullied. The sheer gravity of the situation was such that Carney had been compelled to convene an emergency meeting with the premiers of all 10 provinces and the leaders of the 3 territories. Such a nationwide convocation is a profoundly rare and solemn event in Canadian politics, a powerful symbolic act typically reserved only for moments of extreme national crisis, such as a constitutional deadlock or a major national security threat. This summit was a direct and coordinated response to President Trump's explicit and public threat to impose a new wave of 35% tariffs on all Canadian exports, a move that would have devastating and widespread ripple effects across every sector of the Canadian economy. The immediate economic shockwaves would not only lead to widespread plant closures and job losses in key sectors like the automotive and forestry industries, but could also trigger a full-blown recession, destabilizing the entire financial system. When questioned by a large and anxious crowd of reporters about the prospects of a pact being reached before the looming deadline, Carney's response was carefully calibrated and bilingual. He stated, in both English and French, that Canada would only agree to a deal if there's one on the table that is in the best interest of Canadians. He then added a crucial and deeply symbolic qualifier in French. It's not our objective to have an agreement at any cost. Il n'est pas dans notre intérêt d'avoir un accord à tout prix. This statement was far more than a simple remark. It was a clear signal to both Washington and the Canadian people that the government was prepared to endure significant economic hardship and stand its ground rather than compromise on core national principles under duress, such as the fundamental right to arbitration in trade disputes, which is seen as a cornerstone of fair trade, or the protection of sensitive cultural industries. To maintain a fragile line of communication and demonstrate a continued willingness to negotiate, the government confirmed that Dominic LeBlanc, the cabinet minister who has been the primary go-between with the Trump administration, would remain in Washington for the rest of the week. His presence was a linchpin in a high-wire act of diplomacy, as he was tasked with finding a path forward where none seemed to exist. As he left the resort that hosted the emergency meeting, Carney characterized the ongoing talks as complex negotiations and affirmed that Canada would use all the time that's necessary. This measured stance underscored a strategy of deliberate patience and a refusal to be rushed into a disadvantageous agreement simply to meet an arbitrary deadline set by a foreign power. The message was clear: Canada would not be coerced. The sudden unraveling of earlier optimism. The Prime Minister's current cautious tone stands in stark contrast to the initial waves of optimism that had characterized the early phases of the trade talks. Initially, Carney had been genuinely hopeful that he could broker a comprehensive accord that would not only prevent new tariffs, but also lead to the elimination of the existing ones that President Trump had imposed earlier in the year. These included crippling 50% levies on Canadian steel and aluminum, industries vital to regions like Quebec and Ontario, as well as a 25% tariff on the value of autos, a measure that threatened the very foundation of Canada's most critical manufacturing sector in the heartland of Ontario. Carney had previously targeted July 21st as a self-imposed deadline for reaching a deal, aiming for a swift and decisive resolution. However, President Trump's recent and escalating threats of new, more extensive tariffs completely upended that carefully constructed timetable, introducing a level of diplomatic chaos that made the hopes of a quick resolution all but vanish. The new threat created an atmosphere of diplomatic brinkmanship, forcing Canadian officials to rethink their entire strategy as the negotiating ground shifted constantly beneath their feet. The frustration with the unpredictability of the Trump administration was a sentiment that resonated powerfully and publicly among Canada's provincial leaders. Doug Ford, the populous premier of Ontario, Canada's industrial heartland and most populous province, declined to disclose the specifics of the closed-door meeting with Carney, citing that such details could compromise the delicate negotiations. Ford was openly candid about the immense difficulty of dealing with President Trump, explaining that the situation is so fluid, it's constantly moving. He lamented the fact that you talk to him one day and all of a sudden he's on some media outlet saying there's a 35% tariff. This statement highlighted a fundamental conflict between a traditional, structured diplomatic process and a highly personalized, media-driven style of governance. Similarly, Quebec's Premier François Legault, a former airline executive, echoed the sentiment of confusion and exasperation, reflecting the uncertainty facing Quebec's crucial aerospace and aluminum industries. Legault's rhetorical question, "What can we get?" was followed by a profound admission of uncertainty. You almost have to ask Donald Trump, and I'm not even sure he knows himself what he wants. These comments from two of Canada's most powerful premiers signaled that the frustration was widespread and that the traditional playbook for international relations no longer applied, forcing Canadian leaders to reconsider their entire strategy. A unified front and diplomatic spats. In a display of national unity, both premiers and Prime Minister Carney spoke of alternative strategies to mitigate the effects of American protectionism. They discussed expanding trade relationships with other nations, fostering greater domestic trade within Canada, and investing in major infrastructure projects. These efforts were presented not just as temporary fixes, but as a long-term plan to bolster the Canadian economy and reduce its over-reliance on the U.S. market, signifying a major strategic pivot away from solely focusing on the southern neighbor. This would entail aggressively pursuing trade deals with countries in Europe and Asia, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, to diversify Canada's export markets. It also involved ambitious plans to remove internal trade barriers between provinces to stimulate growth and investing in transformative infrastructure like new transit lines and ports to connect domestic markets more efficiently. The already strained relations between the two countries flared up earlier in the day when a high-profile diplomatic spat occurred, serving as a microcosm of the larger conflict. David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, publicly rebuked Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada. According to a report from the Canadian Press News Agency, Hoekstra, a former Republican congressman from Michigan and a political appointee, had stated at a conference in Washington state that provincial bans on the sale of American liquor and wine were among the reasons why President Trump found Canada mean and nasty to deal with. The ambassador's comments, likely intended to appeal to a domestic audience in the U.S., struck a nerve. Eby's response was swift, defiant, and drew a clear line in the sand. He told reporters that if you're a mean and a nasty Canadian for standing up for our sovereignty, our economy, and our jobs, well, I think most Canadians would be proud to be considered mean and the nasty. His statement not only served as a powerful defense of Canada's trade policies, but also highlighted the growing sense of national pride and resolve in the face of what many Canadians perceive as bullying tactics from the United States. This public exchange underscored the deteriorating state of diplomatic relations.